just by asking you, what system are you trying to change and why?
I suppose you could say it's a number of systems. We are looking at, well, Innovation Unit is interested in pretty much all public services and is looking at health systems, criminal justice systems, local government systems for things like housing, children in care. But our heartland and the passion that I have is in education. And I say a number of systems because we are working both now in developed countries, domestically, but also in developed countries like Canada, Australia, the States, but also in emerging nations and developing systems. And I say that because I think the challenge and the task is really rather different in the two. Obviously, there's some sort of intermediate as well, which is an interesting sort of hybrid. But fundamentally, it is the system of education from birth to death, which unfortunately, of course, has been segmented and chopped into a series of phases which have been all too discrete and disconnected.
Okay. Tell me a bit about the difference between the developed and the developing.
Well, one difference, I think, plainly, is that for a while it seemed to be taken for granted that developing nations would seek to mimic and reproduce the systems created really since around about 1800, most particularly though in the 19th and 20th centuries for schooling and the related higher education system too. And I don't think that's anymore quite necessarily the taken for granted wisdom. I mean, the Millennium Development Goals set as a target access to primary school for all children. And whilst access to schooling was thought to be unproblematic at that time when they were set, I think now, given the whole range of challenges which no doubt we'll be talking about, but most particularly and obviously that of technology, reproducing the systems of schooling, its custodial functions, its expectations around a professionalised workforce and so forth, aren't necessarily taken for granted. So the concept of leapfrogging becomes real, or certainly, at any rate, a more hybrid, more blended, newly created system becomes a reality in some of the contexts with which we are engaged.
And what is it within the education system, domestically, let's say, that you are trying to change?
What is it? More or less everything, I think. You have to start with what's the purpose of the system in the first place. And there's no doubt, I believe, that our system is fundamentally misdirected now. I mean, it was created for a different age with different assumptions. It was assumed that it would be about sorting and filtering and filling jobs in an industrial economy. We're post-industrial. We're post-modern. We're into a digital and increasingly interesting technological series of technologies which transform every aspect of life. And so the fundamentals of the state providing a system, a set of interconnected institutions, expectations and actions to educate its populace, its citizens, need, in our view, to be rethought. So if you start with that premise, and by the way, you don't even have to be that radical to acknowledge that there's a lot wrong with ours. I mean, even in its own terms, it's patently failing. Even in its own terms, it's incapable, first of all, of creating powerful learners, of people who can earn a living effectively and change the ways in which they earn a living throughout their lives. We have huge numbers of unfilled jobs and new technologies crying out for skilled people and something like 2.5 million unemployed. If we just stay domestically, and worldwide that's reproduced as all the data show. So even as a machine to feed economies, the system is maladjusted. But if you ask more fundamental questions about really what kind of people are we trying to create, really profound questions about what the purpose of the induction of our young people into our societies is about, then you get a very different series of answers. And they have to do partly with our being capable of continuing to live on the planet, which right now we're not headed towards doing. They're about creating good growth, which is connected. They're about people who can be entrepreneurial and creative and not just fit into round pegs and round holes and all of that stuff. They are about people who are who understand the importance of global competence and being part of a global citizenry and not simply one which is domestic and narrow and parochial. All of these fundamental objectives seem to us to entail a rethinking of how we go about educating young people, and that, finally I should add, of course, that the existing system is so fundamentally inequitable. The inequity of the outcomes, again, is scandalous. People are condemned fundamentally by the accident of birth to outcomes which are utterly insufficient for their potential and for what we all need. So that, in our view, needs us to think about how these complex, not just complicated, but complex sets of institutions and expectations have been solidified over the years, and what we can do to really reshape, reform, reinvent a fit-for-purpose system.
Okay, great. And how important do you think it is to articulate a vision of where you're aiming for?
Well, I mean, we have moved to the point of believing that understanding system change is fundamental to this, which is why I find your enterprise a very interesting one. Because for the last, I suppose, in my case, 8-10 years, we've been very focused on practice, on the work of professionals within the system and paraprofessionals, and how we create far more innovative learning environments. So I won't call it that quite at the micro level, but certainly at the institutional level. And I think we've reached the point now where, I am coming to your question about vision, where we have sufficient, highly visionary, highly effective, quite transformed organisational forms. Sometimes they still look like schools, sometimes they're really very different indeed, to give us a pretty good sense of what this is all about. But we believe now that we will get no further really until we start to think about system change at a big picture level. How it is that the existing arrangements do remain so intransigent and so resilient to shift, despite the efforts of some really extraordinarily talented and committed and driven people and very committed educators and young people themselves, learners themselves too. And to think about system in that way requires you to understand something about the system dynamics of that with which you are concerned. So if you think about the system dynamics, you need to understand what are the elements that are involved in any systemic shift. And you better be pretty confident that you've at least clocked them all, that you've kind of done a reasonable job of understanding what they are, even if you don't fully understand how they interrelate in all kinds of circumstances. We've done that. We've created a series of elements which we think of in sort of mapping terms, and we try to enable the system leaders with whom we're working over a period of time to think about how those elements are interconnected in their own system. At the forefront of them is the whole issue of vision. So to come back in a loop to your question. And our own view is that there are two fundamental elements with which one must begin. One is around building a case for change, which in a sense I did when we started this conversation very briefly. We need to understand what it is that is fundamentally broken and not fit for purpose in the system. If people aren't seized with that, they simply won't generate the energy or the drive, because it's hard stuff. There are many forces, marshals against the kinds of change that we're talking about. So unless a case for change has been built which is compelling at the personal, at the societal level, then there's no energy for shift. But that needs to be twinned with an articulated vision of how things could be different. And of course, the whole business of vision building is not me standing on a plinth relating what came to me in a dream, however articulately I might do that, but is built rather more painstakingly of a series of aspects, I suppose, including existing practice in which one can say, look, this is not a fairy tale, it's happening here, it's happening in a dozen environments. It's not that it's something we're reaching out for and can't even imagine what it looks like. We've got elements of this practice assembled in different kinds of ways. We've got glimpses. We've got emergent evidence of real power here. And that, if it can be twinned with a set of values that people hold dear, might mean that you have an energizing system which, allied with the case for change, can give you the kind of dynamism to create a movement. Because I suppose the other thing I want to inject in straight away is that with the shifts, the psychological, technological, technical, social revolution that we've witnessed, none of this is done now by elegant and eloquent leaders. It has to be a mass movement. It has to involve behaviour change on the part of parents, learners themselves, professionals in the system, as well as those who are policy makers and seek to guide it going forward. It has to be a very broad alliance of these people.
And so the vision is owned by that alliance,
exactly,
rather than something that is
exactly
agreed upon.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to pick up on a couple of things you mentioned in that. The elements of the system you talk about. I'm interested in your perception of what those elements are.
Yeah. Well, we have started to think about this in terms of a series of generic elements, which you could say are relevant to probably all the systems which you have in your purview when you're thinking about this overview. There are some which are specific to radical innovation, and there's a further set which are specific to education. So we think of them in three groupings, if you like. Let's take the general ones first of all. And I've already talked about two of those elements. Firstly, there's the building the case for change. And that's not just a psychological or emotional matter. Building the case is literally that, deriving the evidence, the comparisons, the data, the fit, really, between what the system pretends or alleges it is trying to do and what the real outcomes are. So with all the elements I'm going to talk about, there's a whole series of actions and technical approaches that one might take. So building the case for change is one, articulating a vision is another. And then about 8 or so more, I probably won't remember them all, but they include the following. They include engaging stakeholders as an iterative process, which isn't done once and for all, but without which you simply will make no progress. There's about enabling the workforce, because I personally have very little patience with people who think that an education system is going to be utterly transformed simply by edupreneurs and people working in edgy spaces, ignoring the vast amount of capital, social capital, physical capital and intellectual capital that we've got locked up in the existing system. And that workforce, for the most part, is not working at its optimal capacity. Very few teachers are doing so. Far too many teachers endure their working life and don't really throw their full selves into it, and they might and they could. And when they see in transformed institutions, yes, teachers working very hard, but teachers who absolutely are passionate about what they do, it's a very different capacity. So working with the workforce, empowering the workforce to firstly adopt a whole different skill set, because it's threatening for people who have been socialised into an understanding of what it is to be a teacher, to be confronted with a very different model. And usually they feel that this is perhaps an ignorance of what it means to teach a discipline, that it threatens the profession as a whole. It's about deprofessionalisation. I think it's none of these things. But to repower the workforce in different ways is a very fundamental element. So that focus on the workforce and its new capacities is another one. We think you need a technology strategy. So one of the big disruptors, thank God, as far as education is concerned, is increasing, month by month, really, the disruptive power of technologies as they fall into the hands, God forbid, of learners themselves, and as yet a minority of teachers. So having a technology strategy in which technologies can be genuinely harnessed for these purposes, not kept out, not feared, not seen as something which somehow diminishes conventional forms of learning, is a very important piece of it. So others would include, let me think, you're going to edit this, so this pause can go. God, I can't remember them now. Workforce strategy. Oh, leadership. So one has to ask, where is the leadership for change going to come to? And developing leadership cadres, people who can offer a different kind of leadership, but leadership nonetheless is, we think, a very different and a very important element of systemic change. And we're very interested, and I suspect you might be too, on what kind of leadership is needed for systemic change, what kinds of leadership capacities and what kinds of experiences people need to take that on. In our context, one of the most fascinating things is it becomes learner leadership as well. So we're not just thinking about the paid professionals who do this, and God forbid, not just the policymakers and politicians. We see learners increasingly, and this isn't just rhetoric. I mean, we are dealing with examples of learners taking on magnificent leadership roles. So that's a further, a very important element. Issues around diffusion strategy. So again, with any change, you may start up a whole series of processes, but unless you're clear about how you take them to scale, and I might talk shortly about some of the strategies that leaders are employing to take this kind of thing to scale. For example, setting up an innovation zone or giving specific leaders particular tasks. If you don't have, right from the outset, a pretty clear view of what your approach to diffusion and growth is going to be, then it will always be trapped, in our view, on location. So there's a whole element around devising a diffusion strategy. So those are the kinds of elements we see in that general space. And I think they're probably applicable to almost any kind of really fundamental shift that you're trying to make in systems. The next are around innovation itself. And for us, there are a series of skills and capacities that we think it's increasingly important for leaders and for professionals and indeed for users of services to take on. So those kinds of innovation methods, which fundamentally are about getting much, much closer to the users of the service, being able to incorporate and internalise the experience of using this service and use that to reshape the service itself, we think is going to be very fundamental. And it's not a once and for all, it's going to be a permanent feature.
Why does that matter for systems change specifically? That kind of getting close to the user, what's the relationship between that and system change?
Well, what I'm doing here is I'm laying out for you a whole set of elements, interconnected elements, which make the thing a system, as opposed to something which is much simpler. So in so doing, our argument would be, or our hypothesis is, that in order to innovate that system, you will continuously get it wrong if you think that the wisdom about both the existing system and its direction of travel in the future is locked up by the professionals. The understanding and the deep experience of users is the fun. I mean, we know that's the fundamental driver. Almost any field of innovation that you look at, the evidence is there that it's through incorporating users' insights as powerfully as you can that you get the most exciting innovation and are able to incorporate that. And by the way, in so doing, of course, you're also involving stakeholders in a different way. You're also creating the kind of movement I've been speaking about. So it's got several kinds of benefit. And then the third category of elements, which are tied up in this whole systemic view, are very specific to education. If you asked any teacher what kinds of things are on the table when we're talking about education change, they probably wouldn't have talked anything about, said a word about what I've just been mentioning. They would go straight to three things: curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, because that's the heartland. But our view, I think, now is that we have done a lot of work on those areas, but without attacking or addressing the other elements I've been talking about, we won't get system change. So curriculum, pedagogy and assessments, yes, it's the three-legged stool, but without innovation methods, without stakeholder involvement, without repowering and reskilling the workforce, we will get similar kinds of answers as we got in the past on those three areas. But in terms of, as it were, what people usually think about in terms of innovation, which is products and services, those are the three elements that clearly we need to reconsider. Again, in my view, the agency of users, learners themselves, and pretty much at any age, are going to be vital to reimagining how curriculum is formed, what curriculum is for, how we determine it, how it changes over time. It's particularly powerful on pedagogy, and in the last 2 years, I think, we have got to a much, much better understanding of the way in which pedagogy and technologies are interwoven, a bit like a double helix, so that as new pedagogy, or rather as new technologies emerge, they enable different kinds of pedagogies, by which we simply mean the design of learning experience. It's not that we used to say, well, it's the pedagogy stupid, and technology is just about assisting in great pedagogy. It's much too simple, because actually pedagogy is emergent as technologies empower quite different ways of working. And similarly with assessment too, that new forms of assessment, for example, online badging, peer assessment, are going to be powerful enablers of learning. Because you've got to ask yourself, again, some of those fundamental questions. What is assessment for? Is it about filtering and sorting so that an employer knows who they're getting? Employers increasingly say that the assessment system is pretty useless for that. Or is it about creating even more powerful learners? Well, if you think it's somewhere in the second space, and I don't dismiss altogether the need for accreditation, then we need to rethink how assessment is designed and users' place in that. So I've gone a bit all over the park there, but just to recap, I've got a series of elements which are general, a series of elements which are about innovation, a series of elements which are specific to education. And taken together, we think that if you address all of those over time, and you have to come back to them clearly, iteratively, then you stand a fighting chance of a changed system.
So I just wanted to pick up again on a couple of things you mentioned there. In terms of the role of institutions within your education system, what role might they play? What role do they play in systems change in your experience?
Well, I think previously, in previous decades, when we've been talking about education reform, the institution was taken as a given. And it was very hard for people to think about a reimagined system of education which didn't focus on the institution of schooling or the institution of higher education. And thankfully, in my view, new technologies have really hit that notion head on and have asked some very fundamental questions about where institutions are heading. If I answer that question personally, I am not of the school, sorry about the pun, I'm not of that persuasion which suggests that school is dead, long live learning, and seeing this entirely as a personalised, aka individualised process in which young people are in front of their Macs or their iPads, working perhaps in collaborative networks, and the school is passé. For myself, and there are plenty of people who disagree with me, but my own view is that it will be important in the coming decades to reshape school in order to, first of all, retain its relevance, because it has the potential to fulfill some very, very important functions. And I'm not just talking about custodial functions to keep the kids safe and off the street here. I'm talking about the functions around the creation of community, around enabling young people to meet other young people physically and learn to collaborate, work with, understand their perspectives, grow empathy, I go back to the question that I asked right at the beginning here. What kind of young people are we trying to grow? We are not, in my view, simply trying to grow powerful learners who are great geeks who can create fantastic algorithms. We have broader objectives. And for young people to be in social circumstances where they can be enabled and empowered to create programs and projects which impact upon their existing communities at really quite young ages are some of the most important developments I see in existing institutions now. So personally, I think that that's going to be a continuing and an important dimension of or function for the institution of school. And naturally, I'm also very concerned, were we to see school becoming irrelevant, see the kind of disintermediation that we've seen in a whole range of other fields where institutions have more or less gone to the wall. I fear for equity, where kids in the most difficult and underprivileged circumstances would be the losers. And I think, notwithstanding the poor outcomes that we get now in terms of overcoming that, reimagined, school could play an important part in it. However, having said, let's not throw this baby, this schooling idea, out with the bathwater, I think that can only happen if the institution is prepared to change fundamentally. So clearly, in higher education, we see the disruptive force now of MOOCs, which is entailing that higher education rethinks its business model pretty damn quick. And it's interesting to me that in the States at the moment, we are seeing policy papers starting to emerge from a number of states asking how online learning should be funded alongside schooling. And I think as soon as people are starting to ask questions about those enabling conditions, which, by the way, I should have mentioned reshaping enabling conditions as one of the elements of the system. When people are starting to ask that kind of question about how the kind of platform for the whole thing works, and I say, hang on a minute, if we are now getting a whole plethora of opportunities for online learning, should we not be asking ourselves, how is that to be funded equitably alongside the old formulae which funded schools? That is a chink in the armour. That is the beginning of the wall breaking down, I think. So it's not just higher education which will have to rethink its business models. If we think about schools providing a very different form of learning space which enables learning in groups, which enables collaborative, collective learning across national borders and across continents, which enables community-focused action and young people being involved in purposeful civic responsibility, in setting up the kinds of planned internships for young people, which give them a really powerful experience of working life, and indeed opportunities for entrepreneurship in very early points of their lives, then you can see school becoming something else, but a very vibrant centre for learning, which is probably inevitably much less obsessed with age groupings, much less configured around classrooms and subject disciplines, will require a different set of skills from the workforce, but plenty of people in the workforce are exhibiting those skills now, so it's not like we need superwomen to do it. It's not like we need Martians. It can and is being done in various parts of the world. But that, of course, coming back to the system, requires the teacher trainers and the teacher developers to rethink what it is to be an educator in this new century. And there's little sign of them really getting into that space, but they're going to have to.
So do you think institutions are prepared to lead system change?
I think some are, unquestionably. With the move to greater devolution of powers to schools, where schools have started to assume the responsibility for their own future and their own identity, you have seen, I think, in some parts of the world, the release of some fantastic energy amongst leadership teams to ask themselves pretty fundamentally, what is it that we want to be here? And I think also the creation of chains, new entrants, bringing very different perspectives into what these institutions might be, and creating a kind of collaborative conversation around that has meant that that is where the energy is coming from. I don't see it at all coming from top-down and policy initiatives. I see it deriving from a number of sources. One, the collaboration of some great institutions which are only held back by the system conditions within which they're required to operate. And that comes back to issues around assessment, of course, and the expectations of higher education and so forth. I see it coming from there. I see it coming from users themselves, learners who are doing it for themselves. So there's a wonderful study of connected learning, which is focused around UMedia in Chicago, which has really started to rethink how learning can take place inside and outside institutions and the kind of role that the institution might play within that. And from some highly charismatic and visionary leaders who are giving the kind of thought leadership and expression to all of this that is so important too. But a variety of sources.
Yeah, okay, and I wanted to pick up on, that was the other point I wanted to pick up on, the leadership point.
Yeah.
I know you've done a lot of work on system leadership time, and I'm interested in how you would describe the differences between system leadership, let's say, and more traditional models of leadership, kind of maybe organisational leadership or whatever. What would you say are the distinctive features of system leadership?
Well, firstly, an understanding that you are in a system.
Right.
That's the first thing. And many leaders don't. And we've seen in education for some time now a kind of emphasis on what used to be called the hero head, the individual who can lead their institution competitively and successfully against a bunch of others without any kind of recognition that their gain is others' loss frequently, and that bright beacons do not a system make. They simply don't, for all the reasons I've been mentioning. So I think the first thing then is understanding that the great game, the real prize, is to think about the system as a whole and your part within it. And if I think about leaders who are working within distributed collaboratives of institutions and thinking about their needs, I kind of get that is part of a very changed perspective. I think that the system leader is capable of re-envisioning objectives for the system as a whole too. So they don't merely think within the given objectives and purposes of the system into which they've been encultured and within which they're expected to operate. They can, as it were, operate what we call within a split screen. So frequently these, to be effective at all, they're in fairly publicly accountable places. So they can't have complete disregard to the systems of accountability that pertain to whatever system they're in. And they have to keep their focus on that screen. They can't be failing young people within the existing metrics, because that's those young people's life chances, and therefore an attention to that's very important. But the split screen is looking to another space where they're also nurturing much more fundamental innovation. Now, whether you are the Chancellor of the New York City school system, or whether you are the chief executive of, say, a chain of 10 schools or so, the system leaders who seem to me to be demonstrating the kinds of skills that we need in the form of system leadership I'm talking about can both keep the system working in its current terms and incrementally improving. We're not saying that we're throwing improvement out the window, but also creating spaces, enabled spaces, with the resource, with the permission, with the blessing of the broader system to innovate on its behalf, with a view that those innovations will be diffused rapidly as soon as they show real signs that they are powerful and will work. So this notion of a split-screen perspective and vision, I think, is probably an important feature.
Great. Okay. Who are your fellow allies and travellers on this journey towards systems change? Where do you look for support and encouragement?
Think about that one. What kind of level of answer are you expecting here on this one?
Kind of seeing what people say. Sorry, that's not very helpful.
No, it's not really. Do you want names or categories?
No, sorry. What, yeah, I should say, yeah, it doesn't have to be like, Sheila or...
No. Okay. Okay. Let me just give it a bit of thought then.
Sure.
So I think the sources of inspiration are various, and it comes back, I think, to some issues around the fundamentals of what we're aiming at. So some of the thought leaders writing in this space at the moment and asking really important questions about where our species is going. I mean, it's as fundamental as that. Are important in requiring an education system to take a jolt and stand back. So some of the writers who are in the space of futures, actually, and curiously I'd mention Al Gore and his book this year called The Future. Writers in the space of creativity and imagination, Daniel Pink and a few others, who will start to help us understand what the successful human, in the coming century might be a bit like. So there's one category. But I think the most important category for me are those system leaders who are in there and actually creating, not just in single environments, but connected systems which are marching to a different drumbeat, and enabling the people who work in them to have the confidence. Confidence is so hugely important in this, to feel that they won't be exposed, they won't be required to take risks that are unmanageable or put other people's life chances at risk, and give others the space in which to bring their full professional imagination and creativity to work. And I can think of 3 or 4 in that space. The other thing that they're doing, of course, is creating a kind of succession of new young leaders, because I'm very wary of what we used to call adjectival leadership, distributed leadership, creative leadership, all that. But they are the kinds of people who are aware that they are mortal, that they are running out of time here, and that we need a whole new cadre of people who have a different vision and have a different skill set and are up for the challenge of enabling people to move forward too. So some of that genuinely inspires me hugely, and I feel hugely humbled to think that they might look to us for some assistance, because I think it's a much more reciprocal kind of arrangement.
Okay. There are 2 more questions I really want to ask before we move on to a bit more about you. One is about blockers. You mentioned blockers earlier. I'm just interested in some brief reflections on what those blockers, what or who those blockers to system change might be from your perspective.
Where to start? I mean, I think in any gathering of head teachers, principals, or anyone working in education systems, too rapidly we move into enumerating all the blockers. And I haven't really touched on them much here, because actually it's much more important to focus on the possibilities and the real opportunities that exist, and they do. However, that's not to be naive. I want to start, curiously, with the media and the hopelessly ignorant, ill-informed, retrogressive media that certainly in the United Kingdom we have, and to a certain extent in the US as well, which is so ready to pounce on any form of unconventional approach to learning, to powerful learning, and ridicule. The power of ridicule is really significant in this space. And I think we have to do a huge amount of work on creating some media allies, and not just relying on social media to help us make progress. I put that first because the obvious way to go is to talk about politicians and their mindsets, and they're often forced by or framed by media understandings of what education systems need to look like. So politicians expect them to be re-elected, almost invariably speak the language of reform. And that reform is timid, is entirely within the existing frame, and I have yet to come across a currently elected or hoping to be elected politician who's prepared to use a different kind of language. Where they sanction innovation, it's pretty much under the wire and under the radar, partly because of the power of the press, I would say. So those 2 I'd start off with. I don't think the universities, taken as a collective, have been anything other than pretty much self-interested in this. There are some notable individual exceptions, of course, writing within universities, giving terrific thought leadership. But as institutions and as a sector, they have been a force for convention and for really solidifying the existing structures. Students don't come to us with the basic in mathematics. We need much stronger disciplinary teaching. Drill it into them until they've got it. I mean, I caricature, but it's to make a point. But I think a dialogue with higher education about its role in a broader system and for everybody and not just for an elite is a very important dialogue to be had. And right now, what universities expect and require of schooling is a very big blocker.
Okay. You've talked a lot about you painted a picture of all the elements of the system we need to think about when we're talking about systems change. Do you have, beyond that, do you have an explicit theory of change? It's something which some people talk about a lot. Some people say, don't need one. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in whether you have one.
Oh, we do. I do. And I've already, I think, alluded to it in passing. It takes shapes and forms in terms of its expression, but I'll reprise and say that I think without two pillars to, as it were, create energy within the system, you won't even get from first base. And those two pillars are, first of all, a sense of the burning platform, a case for change which is so compelling that people are brought to the state of realising, up with this we cannot put. We must take action on this. It simply will not do. And that's critical. And that might arise from their sense of justice or injustice. It might arise from their sense of the kind of challenges that we face, either as a society or as a human race, whatever. But some burning platform that enables them to say, I'm going to give this the energy that I might put into other stuff. That's one pillar. And then the second pillar is a sense of possibility. So in our work, we try to do two things. One is enable people themselves to articulate and come to terms with their own case for change, and it will be different in different contexts. But secondly, a very important part of our work as an intermediary in innovation is to say there are possibilities. This is within our grasp. It is not beyond our capacity to assemble the constituent parts of a new system which is fundamentally different, fundamentally more powerful, and inspirationally important for both the young people who are the beneficiaries and the people who work within that system. So I want to start off with those two things. And if you're capable then of exciting or creating that level of energy in the first place, then a number of things start to flow. The notion of alliance is hugely important. So if we're talking about a system being a complex, interconnected, interdependent series of elements, institutional or behavioural elements, then the creation of a leadership alliance to drive it forward, if you've generated that surge of energy, is the next stage. You're not going to be able to do it alone. You're never going to be able to do it as a single leader, either in a small community or a nation or whatever kind of canvas you're working on. You have to understand what it means to create a leadership alliance. Move outside your comfort zone, move outside the people you normally speak to and who use your jargon and your language, as I'm doing now. That will include, for example, perhaps media, or it may include people who are so-called recipients of the education system, the business community, those who create and enable jobs, to be a genuine, authentic part of the conversation and part of the leadership of the shift. So the creation of a leadership alliance is the next phase down. And then after that, it's around, going to the elements I talked about, creating or addressing some of the system conditions which hold the existing system in stasis. And here we start to get more analytical, understanding what those system conditions are, whether they're about funding, whether they're about governance, whether they're about accountability, but starting to recognise how the alliance that we've created, with the energy which we've managed to generate, can start to address those system conditions. And if you get those right, then you might stand a chance of your institutions looking and feeling and being very, very different.
Okay, thank you. About you. Tell us about your journey. Tell us about your journey into systems change. your own personal journey?
Well, I was a local government hack, so I think that if you worked in and then within government for a short time, those are pretty tough and resilient systems. And I tried to offer leadership in an education system, in a fairly large one. It was 500 schools, which was a bruising and a painful experience. I think I wouldn't say I was damaged for a while. I found it an enormously bruising and painful experience, and I think I probably lacked all of the understanding that I've been talking about now. It's been hard won and hard developed, but walking away from that with that history made me initially determined never to go near it again. And then in a sort of a second wave thinking, you know what, I do want to return to that, but I want to be part of a movement and a force which fundamentally shakes it up. So from working in schools, from working in a university, from working in local government, from working within central government, I think I've got a bit of a handle on how those systems work and what it is that the very able and talented people, in some of them, locks them in shape and diminishes them and disables them from bringing their full selves to the task. And I think that that history is partly why Innovation Unit, which is where I give my energy, has never walked away from the public services and the workforce within them. So as I've already said, lots of institutions have said, well, let's set up a social enterprise. Let's do it ourselves on the margins and show what it can be. We don't do that. We work with the people in the systems who want to be more than they currently are, be everything they can be, and not feel that they have to be outside the system altogether to have any effect whatsoever. So we really do believe, I really do believe that that they should not be abandoned. That's a huge investment. That's a huge volume of all kinds of capital that it's very well worth working with. And so that's why we do the work we do.
Okay. And how do you describe your work to people who aren't in your field?
Probably not very effectively. We use the language of being an intermediary, being a broker, being a coach, a supporter. We are more focused, I think, on trying to say what it is we do rather than what it is we are. And what it is we do is much easier to articulate because we can bring understandings, tools, processes which we can demonstrate have worked elsewhere to a new context and put them at the service of people who want change. And for the most part, potential innovators in the public services are very hungry for those because it's hard. It's not just a question of understandings, but that's the beginning. It really is having some really smart tools that enable you to make the kind of progress that you need to. And we've worked hard now to assemble those and to put them in a shape where whether you're working in an education department in local government or in a chain of schools or as a chief executive of an agency, you can see how those might really be transformational for the people that you work with. So it's in those terms, I think, the kinds of tools and processes, understandings that we bring to any different context.
And if I were to ask you to pull out your diary from last week, what would be in it? What did you spend your time doing last week?
Well, last week I spent my time preparing a series of workshops and presentations which are going to be used with a series of global education leaders who are running education systems. And they are people who range from being deputy ministers of systems, working in mayors' offices, working in teacher preparation, chief executives of chains of academies, leaders of innovation zones in major cities, and they're in systems as diverse as Rio de Janeiro, New York City, British Columbia, India, Australia. So it's pretty diverse. They are, and South Korea. So you have within the group a diverse a diverse collection of system leaders from the most, quote, successful education systems in the world to those facing the greatest challenges. They are coming together next week, and so last week my time was spent with a group of people putting the finishing touches to what we hope will be a great learning experience for them. And the learning experience, coming back to some of the things that we've been talking about, is going to have 3 foci. One focus is going to be on learner agency and what kinds of strategies system leaders can put in place to release learner agency. I'm not just talking about student voice here. I'm talking about learner leadership. I'm talking about much more democratic institutions. I'm talking about the ways in which learners can be significant determiners of their own learning journey. So learning agency is one focus. A second focus is going to be on new metrics. If we think that the ways in which learning is measured is really important and is one of the system conditions really that hold things in place, these system leaders want to know how on earth can we make progress on creating new metrics, measuring the things that we value, like creativity, critical thinking, collaboration between just individuals and groups. Can we really move to a point where we have a system of metrics which is reliable and resilient and commands public respect, which will overtake the existing inadequate set of metrics which are so basic and fundamental about literacy and numeracy? So that's the second focus, new metrics. And then the third focus is on new players. Who are the new players who are entering the education scene, changing systems, shaking it up, offering different kinds of models, offering huge challenges to the existing schooling, and sometimes creating fantastic collaborations with schools, which might just create the ways of reshaping, reforming them. So those are the 3 foci, and we've tried to create a week-long learning experience for people at the top of their profession who at the same time want to work a bit underneath the radar to create change. And that's been a great week, and I hope next week will be even better.
Sounds like it'll be great, yeah. And thinking about the year ahead, what are the challenges you foresee in your work around systems change?
So is that a specific question to
It's for you.
For me?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. Okay, well, I'll answer the question at a number of levels. I think there's a very important challenge in the coming year or two to contribute at a significant level to thought leadership around our objectives in transforming learning. And I worry that that debate has been hijacked or really taken over by a lobby around technology and by people who think that the shift is fundamentally technologically driven and is about how we have a new digitech education system. And I think that that is a huge and important disruptive force. I value it immensely. I welcome it. But as I try to remark earlier, I don't think it's the whole story. And I think we have to be asking some more fundamental questions around the direction of travel for learning in an increasingly complex world. And I'd really like to contribute to that debate and to try to create different parameters for the debate. So that's at one level. A second level, I think, is for Innovation Unit, with which I work. And I think that for us to be optimally effective, we work a great deal already internationally. And I think that we'd like and we need really to increase that penetration of working with a really diverse set of systems so that we have an even better global picture of the possibilities of diverse systems arising. Curiously, we feel less empowered working in our domestic system right now and under current circumstances. But we know there are pockets with which we can work, and we'll continue that. But to do it at really optimal power, I think, we need a really well-grounded sense of what is emerging in different parts of the world. And I talked about leapfrogging earlier. I think that we'll be seeing in East Africa, I think we'll be seeing in some parts of Asia, really very interesting and utterly different kinds of models that we will want to be thinking about and starting to create or co-create as part of our overall picture. So I think becoming even more international, even more global, is a challenge and a hugely exciting possibility.
And final question from me. How hopeful do you feel about achieving your ambition of systems?
It depends when you ask me. When I've just been, last year, with colleagues from Innovation Unit, we wrote a book called Learning a Living, and we were invited to look at a range of innovators across the world who were successful in innovating different kinds of learning experiences for young people so that they could learn their living, learn how to make a living in all kinds of ways. And we visited 15 such innovators across the world, every continent. At the end of it, I felt wonderful. I thought, this is doable, it's there. Coming back to the whole business about identifying possibilities. We feel that you can bottle it, and the more people understand about what these innovators are doing, and they're not superheroes. We can understand the preconditions that enable them to be successful. And when I see that, I think, yeah, we can do this. We can do this. At other times, I look at the poverty of the public discourse around education, which I think is a disgrace, and I become discouraged. But you only need to go back into one of the great environments that there are extant now to get a sense of optimism. Whether it'll happen as a system in my lifetime is another matter. But yeah, I believe.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Is there anything that came up that you would have liked to have gone into more, or actually I've got one thing.
Okay.
No, after you then. Things you think I should have asked?
I don't know if that's yours or mine. I don't think so. No, it's funny thinking about my personal journey. I haven't reflected on that at all, really. Yeah.
It's interesting how some people answer it very, very personally, and some people kind of a bit. I haven't thought about that before.
Was I on the personal front or not?
Not as much as so much.
Right. Well, I mean, I talked about my history and some wounds. Certainly wouldn't, in terms of my own children or anything like that. That's not been an important issue particularly. I probably would have done if they'd been, dyslexic dropouts who were damaged by the system, which they could easily have been. Happens not to be the case. They kind of succeeded in spite of it.
So the thing I wanted to ask you, which I realised I didn't, is given your work globally, are there different understandings of what the system is and what constitutes system change in different parts of the world?
Oh yes, there definitely are. And I think part of our work, when you talk about what is it that we do, is to invite people to reflect upon what is the system, capital T, capital S. And if you just take, for example, the UK, our understanding for years has been the system is the system of institutions, the schools, local government which managed them, and government itself which funded and raised the taxes in order to keep the whole thing together. And it was a kind of linear relationship that people understood, perhaps with alongside a system of private schools for which people paid alongside it. But still, we understand now that the transformation that we need of learning entails completely reimagining what the system must be. And that means bringing in players who have been peripheral or non-existent in the whole piece. I've mentioned business already, and I absolutely believe that the time is ripe not to imagine business as just a cash cow who through corporate social responsibility will write some checks or complain about the output and demand basic skills and so forth, but will have a much more meaningful conversation about what good growth, what kinds of skills people will need in the future and how we get them. And some of the best employers in the world are creating their own learning systems to do that well, and they're doing it brilliantly. So there's no question. Edupreneurs, technology entrepreneurs as well. The cultural and creative sector have got to be part of this conversation. So to answer your question, rethinking what is the system in whatever context is absolutely fundamental. And so wherever it is that we happen to work, people have, slightly modulated versions of the linear system, but that is changing and changing fast. And I think you see that in the United States now, where the explosion of edutech companies and vendors who are co-producing materials, and particularly around, for example, the possibilities of learning analytics and big data with state authorities and with districts. It's going to create a very, very different approach, I think. So under thinking system and thinking reinventing system is all part of the process, I think.
Thank you.
Yes, all right.
Thank you so much.
That's
I really
okay.
appreciate it.
Good.
I hope it was